Hello, my name is Glenn Siegel, and welcome to this breakout session as part of Illumin's Solarize 2020. As you know, the mission of Illumin is men transforming men through a power greater than ourselves. And the ways in which we do this are through story, image, ritual, counsel, and nature. In this particular session, I'm going to be telling you my story in relation to nature. It starts about 5.5 years ago when I was in northern New Mexico in a ponderosa pine forest. I was part of a 5-day intensive immersion in a nature-based program and had been sent out on a wander. I found myself drawn to a place that had a sharp demarcation in the land. On one side, there was a fairly absent number of trees. There weren't very many trees. And the ground had a low cover of green, succulent plants with white flowers. And on the other side of the line were this grove of pine, really grand ponderosa pines. And I chose to take a rest and lie down in the green, soft, lush area using my knapsack and my backpack as a pillow on a stone of granite. And while I was lying there, I was transported into the sounds of the place. There were bees humming around my ears in the flowers. I could hear the distant rush of a stream. And I could also hear the wind dancing in the treetops of the pines in front of me. At some point, I felt this pull, a kind of magnetic pull on my body. And I responded to it by getting up and following the energy of this pull. And it took me across the borderline into the forest of the ponderosa pines and immediately directed me to a particular tree with a small dead branch about eye level. And hanging from it was this tuft of lichen. I knew this what was calling me because as I got closer, I felt the energy increase. All of a sudden, I experienced this, what I can only call mystical feeling, the sense that I was connected to everything. There was a sense of unitive, boundaryless nature. I no longer felt my own borders, and I just began to merge with the energy of the environment. And it was so rapturous in feeling, so love-filled, that I was mesmerized and held. Eventually, I felt drawn to the lichen itself, since it seemed to be emanating the energy. And I began to experience it as a feminine presence because it seemed to be all about relationship. And I wanted to touch it. And eventually, I found myself mixing this branching, filamentous nature, this being, into my own beard. I'm going to show you a photograph of the kind of lichen so you can imagine what it would be like to mix your beard, if you have one, into this being. Here's a look at it. And actually, I've learned since that Some of the species that look like this are called old man's beard. As I stayed there, I began to feel that I was developing some kind of long-term relationship with this being, and it felt like I was entering into a commitment of some kind, almost like a marriage or being betrothed. And I unambivalently entered into this. There was no question in my mind, feeling this depth of love holding and surrounded me, that this was the path I wanted to be on. And so I did. I stayed for some brief period, felt this intense connection deepen, and then eventually it was time for me to leave. And as I left the forest, it was as though I was walking with gravity down an aisle, as though I had been in a marriage ceremony. Since that time, I've been trying to understand what happened to me. And my first step was to become an apprentice, to learn as much about lichen as I could. Like most people, I was, although attracted and interested in the natural world, I was usually drawn to the grand schemes, the grand vistas, mountains, waterfalls, oceans, big scenery that was compelling. And I had never really noticed lichen. It was peripheral to me. And so it was unexpected and surprising that it was this kind of being that would have called me so. So I had to learn about it. Why me? I wasn't a scientist. What is it that it was singling out in me and inviting me into this relationship? I began to study about lichen. I've learned some remarkable things, and I'll share a few of them with you because they are the beginnings of the teachings for me. Lichen is not really classifiable. It's not a plant. It's certainly not an animal. And it is one of the earliest beings that has inhabited the land out of the ocean. It's among the first on land, along with algae. And it is a composite being. It is a symbiotic relationship being between a fungus and an algae, or a cyanobacteria, another kind of blue-green algae. And in the relationship is the first example of symbiosis on the planet. And somehow, the fungus and the algae found a way to bridge their disparate, incredible differences. They're not in the same kingdoms, and merge into this wholly new organism that becomes neither fungus nor algae. And so there's this trinity of sorts that two beings become a third. And the power of that for me is in the teaching of how to bridge extreme differences. And among humans ourselves, what would happen if we were able to do that? If we weren't so keen on finding those that are the same as us, that we can share comfortably ourselves with. There's a profound wisdom in being able to bridge the gap of such extreme difference. And the fact that symbiosis is a result, we would have never evolved on this planet had not symbiosis began at the level of lichen. And it is a long time ago. Lichen's estimated to have been on the planet either as much as 500 million years ago to maybe 1 billion years ago. And its symbiotic experiment is really what has allowed the evolution of higher beings like us to occur. We are filled with symbiotic relationship. Every cell of our body relies on mitochondria, which was formerly a bacterium, as our energy producers. And so within us is a symbiotic relationship, first pioneered by Lichen. It also, because of its ability to live on this planet through every cataclysmic event that's ever occurred, has some kind of extraordinary intelligence to survive. If we measure success and intelligence by adaptation to the natural environment, it is a supreme example of that. It lives in every kind of habitat on the planet, from Arctic to desert, cold, hot, dry, wet. It has the capacity to stay dormant when the period of nutrition or water is sparse or empty. And this can go on for years. So it knows, has a deep wisdom of enduring survival in relationship to the natural world. And even though it grows on things like trees, stones, it does not harm the trees that it grows on. It merely uses them as an anchor. So it has found a way to survive without destroying its natural environment. It even has, through some erosion of stone, created substrate for new plants to grow also in soil that it has helped create. So this is a generative being. Generative one that lives in reciprocity, that has the capacity to endure hardship, and has bridged disparate differences. These are the beginnings of the teachings for me that I see as a human, as humanity. We need to know this. We need to live into this kind of way. But beyond the universal descriptions that I've just given you, this became a personal journey for me. As I began to deepen my relationship through learning, through apprenticeship, I began to have a longing for interaction with Lichen more. And at one point, I began to feel deprived. Like, why couldn't I have had some kind of spirit animal that interacted, that made a sound, that moved? Why was I drawn to something that was completely still and silent and can never give me any kind of response? Very, very hard, very painful for me. This led me into my deepest core wound. And this is the personal journey and the transformational one that Lichen has guided me into. A couple of years after my first encounter with Lichen, this transformative encounter, I was driving back to New Mexico. And during my drive, I was busily concocting email responses in my head to some emails that I had received that were annoying to me. I was irritated by the content, by something that I felt dismissed by, something like that. And I was concocting these email responses that I thought would be really clever, witty, with unassailable opinions that I would have some kind of a upper hand in my response. And all of a sudden, I heard my own voice say, "Look at you. What a petty process you're in." And even more surprisingly, I heard myself respond saying, "Is that you, Lichen?" I'd never spoken to Lichen. That just came without any plan. And the next thing I heard, again through my own words, was, "Remember, I came to you in love." So that began a deep teaching for me about the power of love in holding me through most challenging situations. Recalling that feeling of being enveloped, a deep belonging, offered to me by this silent, still being, ancient being, my ancestor, my symbiotic ancestor. At some point I decided I need to start writing about this experience. And so I had a plan to go to a monastery in northern New Mexico, spend 9 days writing about Lichen. I went there, and there was lichen all around outside my cell at this monastery. And within the first couple of hours, I noticed on the wall of my little cell a painting. And it captured my attention. It was by a painter named William Adolphe Bourgereau, French painter. And it was called L'Innocence, the innocence. And at first I just noticed it, and then I was drawn to it more deeply. I'm going to show you this picture of this painting. As you can see, it's depicting Mary and Jesus, really. It's a radiantly loving pose, a very, very serene, natural world pose. She's barefoot near the forest, near it looks like a stream possibly. And in the other arm, she's holding a lamb. And this lamb is looking out in the distance. And something affected me very deeply when I looked at this painting. I didn't understand what. I did know that this was a story that would result in a sacrifice of a sacrificial lamb, an assault on innocence at some point. And that's what I think began to stir in me. That evening, when I went to sleep, I tried to go to sleep in my cell. I began having this sense that if I didn't remain vigilant, I would stop breathing. I'd never felt that before. And each time I would start to drift off to sleep, I would gasp in a panic and have to stay awake because I thought I would stop breathing if I didn't. This went on all night. And I became terrified that I would never be able to breathe if I ever slept. I got up several times, wandered around outside, looked at the stars, the moon, kept trying, and it would happen over and over again. I was so terrified by this that I actually packed up my belongings and left the monastery at about 4 a.m. or 3 a.m. in the dark, drove the 13 miles of dirt road it took to get back to a highway, and then kept driving all the way to Amarillo, Texas. I partly wondered, well, maybe it's the altitude. If I just come down to a lower altitude, maybe I'll be able to breathe more easily. But when I got to Amarillo and was exhausted, I checked into a motel and again tried to sleep. And the same thing happened. Again, a whole night of no sleep and terror about dying if I let myself drift into sleep. I eventually got home, and the same thing, the third night, the same thing happened. I was sitting up in the chair in the middle of the night in my home wondering if I would ever get out of this, if I would ever be able to sleep, or if I was just going to die and somehow stop breathing. And while sitting in my chair, I heard a voice again. You must love your way into your own death. These are thoughts that I would not have come up with. This is not my way of thinking. And again, I feel this is Lichen's gift and teaching coming to me. This one even more profound. And so I decided to try this. I decided when I drifted off to sleep, I was going to embrace my own death, if that's what was to come. And so as I drifted off and the terror began, I let it go. I embraced this sense of dying. And I found myself awake 5 hours later. I slept for 5 hours. And I felt this incredible relief that I had accomplished this through love. What I have since learned is that in my own personal history, I too started out, like in that painting, with a mother that cherished me, loved me, looked at me radiantly. I have photographs from my infancy that look like that. But in my childhood, mysteriously, without any explanation to me, she faded from my life and then died. And the devastation of that, I was 9 by the time she died, was so overwhelming that I was unable to allow any feeling of it to come in, because I think my psyche felt I would be obliterated by it. So I had never truly reckoned with the grief of that wound. And that painting in that cell in that monastery, through a single image, penetrated all of my defenses and got to the deep grief that in my childhood was equated with dying if I were to feel it. And so the importance of this journey for me is that I came to that monastery to follow a need to write about Lichen. And what I was led into was my deepest woundedness by that journey. I would have never gone there had love not been the way that Lichen brought me into this. I had spent decades avoiding grief at that level because of an old sense that it would kill me if I were to feel it. Not conscious, but I was deeply protected. And Lichen found a way, this is my belief, to guide me to a place where an image would penetrate my defenses, being held by the love of Lichen, in order to me to start to do this inner work that I had so avoided for so long. There have been several other wisdom teachings from Lichen. And I know they are from Lichen because they are not my thoughts. One of the introductions to this whole journey of grief was that the very nature of Lichen's stillness and silence, the very characteristics of what happened to me when my mother, a vibrant woman, died young and became nothing but silence and absence, a stillness and a silence that was so hard for me. And lichen, by its very nature, lives like that and brought me into relationship through a loving mystical connection that led me back into facing the deepest pain and wound of my life, which I have needed to go through in order to grow more deeply spiritually. Lichen has taught me that one must go and revisit our wound from every phase of development that we go through. It is as though the wound is a precious gem inside us, multifaceted, and that each stage of our development, we're invited to go back and visit the wound as though we're looking in it from a different facet of it. Lichen has taught me that love is the most unifying fabric of the universe and can hold anything. Lichen has taught me that it's useful to find a teacher in the natural world, probably a single teacher, one that you can go in deeply with, and that lichen is just one energy node in a cosmic fabric, and that for each of us, our teacher may come in a different form. And lichen has taught me that reckoning with one's own death is a crucial part of the journey toward spiritual awakening. You know, lichen has many other extraordinary qualities which I don't really have time to go into here. But given its capacity to endure for millions of years, and our likely inability to do so based on our disconnections and divisions and living outside of love, we will likely annihilate ourselves and a lot of other species along with us. But it's most certain to me that no matter what we do, lichen will most likely continue to exist on this planet and possibly give us another chance to re-evolve. Peace.